The twin foals were dying in Jake's arms, their mother's frozen body already buried in snow, when Ghost did something impossible. The white stallion adopted them on the spot, defying nature itself in a way that would soon bring the world to Jake's isolated Montana ranch. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The blizzard had been howling across the Montana high country for 3 days when Jake Mercer made the decision that would change everything. His white stallion, Ghost, stood patient in the barn doorway, steam rising from his nostrils in the frigid air, as if the horse understood what his master was about to do. The other ranch hands thought Jake was crazy for even considering riding out in weather like this, but Jake had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and right now every fiber of his being was telling him that something out there needed him. At 42 years old, Jake had spent more than half his life working the Broken Creek Ranch in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains. He was a man of few words and fewer friends, someone who preferred the company of horses to people, who found solace in the rhythm of ranch work and the vast silence of the wilderness. His weathered face bore the marks of countless seasons spent under the Montana sun and snow, deep lines around his blue-gray eyes that spoke of squinting into distances most men never bothered to look. His hands were calloused and strong, capable of gentleness when needed, which was more often than people realized. Ghost, his 13-year-old Arabian stallion, had been his constant companion for the past decade. The horse was unusual for ranch work, more commonly associated with show rings and breeding programs than the brutal practicality of cattle operations. But Jake had won Ghost in a poker game from a desperate businessman who had no idea what to do with a high-strung purebred, and the two had formed a bond that transcended the typical relationship between man and animal. The stallion was intelligent, responsive, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense danger or distress. More than once, Ghost had saved Jake's life, whether by refusing to cross unstable ground or by alerting him to predators lurking in the darkness. Now, as Jake cinched the saddle tight and checked his supplies, he could feel Ghost's tension, the way the stallion's muscles quivered with anticipation beneath the thick white coat that had grown in for winter. The horse knew they were going out into the storm, and unlike the other horses in the barn who shifted nervously in their stalls, Ghost seemed almost eager for it. The wind hit them like a physical blow the moment they left the shelter of the barn. Snow swirled in blinding sheets, reducing visibility to mere feet, and the temperature had dropped so low that Jake could feel the moisture in his nose freezing with each breath. He pulled his sheepskin collar higher, the fleece-lined leather of his coat offering some protection against the savage cold, but he knew exposure could kill a man in conditions like these. The lantern he carried, its flame protected by thick glass, cast a warm, golden glow that seemed pitifully small against the vast white wilderness surrounding them. Ghost moved forward with sure-footed confidence, his broad hooves finding purchase in the deepening snow. Jake gave the stallion his head, trusting the horse's instincts more than his own limited vision. They had no specific destination, just a vague pull toward the northwest, toward the higher elevations where the storm would be even worse. Jake couldn't have explained to anyone why he felt compelled to ride out in this direction, why something in his gut insisted that he needed to be out here, searching for something he couldn't name. The ranch hands back at the bunkhouse probably thought he'd finally lost his mind. Old Mercer riding out into a blizzard for no good reason, they'd say, shaking their heads over their coffee and card games. Let him freeze if he wants to. Jake had never cared much what others thought of him, a trait that had served him well in a life that often required making hard decisions alone. He'd been called stubborn, difficult, antisocial, and worse, but he'd also been called reliable, honest, and the best horseman in 3 counties. He'd take the latter any day. They rode for what felt like hours, though Jake knew it had probably been less than one. Time had a way of distorting itself in storms like this, where the world narrowed to just the next step, the next breath, the next moment of endurance. Ghost's ears swiveled constantly, listening for sounds that human ears couldn't detect through the roar of wind and the hiss of driving snow. Suddenly, the stallion stopped, his entire body going rigid. Jake felt it immediately. That change in the horse's posture that meant Ghost had sensed something. Then he heard it. At first, Jake thought it might be the wind playing tricks, creating sounds that weren't really there. But Ghost heard it too, his ears locked forward, his nostrils flaring. It was a cry, high-pitched and desperate, barely audible above the storm, but unmistakable once Jake focused on it. Not a human cry, but not quite animal either. Something young, something in distress, something that wouldn't survive much longer in this killing cold. Jake urged Ghost forward, following the sound. The stallion moved carefully through drifts that came up past his knees, his powerful muscles working to break trail. The crying grew louder, more insistent, and Jake felt his heart beginning to race with a mixture of anticipation and dread. What could possibly be out here, alive and vocal, in the middle of a blizzard that had shut down every living thing with sense enough to seek shelter? They crested a small rise, and there, huddled together in the lee of a fallen pine tree, were two of the smallest, most pitiful creatures Jake had ever seen. Twin foals, dark as midnight against the white snow, their coats already thick with ice, their spindly legs trembling with cold and exhaustion. They couldn't have been more than a few days old, still carrying that newborn ungainliness, their eyes huge with fear and confusion, as they cried out for a mother who would never answer. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he took in the scene before him. The mare lay a dozen feet away, her body already half buried in snow, her dark coat dusted white like a monument to tragedy. Jake could see what had happened with the practiced eye of someone who had witnessed the harsh realities of nature countless times before. She had been trying to find shelter when labor began, had given birth to twins in the worst possible conditions, and had simply not had the strength to survive it. Twin births were rare in horses, and even rarer were both foals surviving. The fact that these two were alive at all was nothing short of miraculous. But without intervention, that miracle would be short-lived. Jake dismounted, his boots sinking into snow that came up to his shins. Ghost stood perfectly still, his training and temperament making him as reliable as an anchor in the chaos of the storm. The foals watched Jake approach with wild, frightened eyes, their small bodies pressed together for warmth that was rapidly failing them. They couldn't have weighed more than 70 pounds each, all legs and ears in desperate confusion. Their dark coats were nearly black, unusual for this region where most of the wild Mustang herds ran to bay and sorrel. These babies had to be from escaped or abandoned stock, perhaps from one of the breeding operations that had gone under during the hard times. The first challenge was catching them. Young as they were, they still had the instinct to flee from predators, and to them, Jake was the most terrifying thing they had ever encountered. When he reached for the nearest one, it lurched backward on unsteady legs, nearly falling in the deep snow. Its sibling let out a distressed whinny, a sound so heartbreaking that Jake felt his chest tighten. These babies had no idea they were dying, only that they were cold and hungry, and their mother wasn't responding to their calls. Jake moved slowly, speaking in the low, soothing voice he used with spooked horses. "Easy now, little ones. Nobody's gonna hurt you. I know you're scared, but you've got to trust me if you want to live." He unbuttoned his heavy coat despite the brutal cold and approached the nearest foal again, this time managing to get his arms around its trembling body before it could bolt. The foal fought him, weak as it was, its small hooves striking out in panic. Jake wrapped it in his coat, holding it against his chest where his body heat might do some good. The second foal was even more terrified now that its sibling had been captured. It tried to run, but its legs gave out and it collapsed in the snow, too weak to rise. Jake's heart clenched at the sight. This one might not make it, he thought, but he'd be damned if he didn't try. He carried the first foal to Ghost, who had been watching the entire scene with alert interest. The stallion lowered his head and sniffed the small creature, his nostrils flaring as he processed this new information. To Jake's amazement, Ghost made a low, soft sound, almost like a rumble of reassurance. Setting the first foal down against Ghost's legs, trusting the stallion not to move, Jake went back for the second one. This foal didn't fight when he picked it up, which worried him more than resistance would have. It simply lay limp in his arms, its breathing shallow, its eyes beginning to glaze. Jake wrapped it in his outer layer and carried it back to where Ghost stood guard over the first foal, who was trying unsuccessfully to stand on legs that shook like saplings in a windstorm. Now came the real problem. How was he going to get two nearly frozen foals and himself back to the ranch on a single horse, even one as strong as Ghost? The stallion could carry Jake's 200 pounds easily enough, but adding two foals, even small ones, was asking a lot. The snow was getting deeper by the minute, the temperature dropping as evening approached, and Jake knew that their window for survival was closing fast. He made a decision. He would walk. Ghost would carry both foals. It was risky in the extreme because if Jake fell or became disoriented, he might not make it back. But these babies had no chance at all without help, and Ghost was their only hope of reaching shelter before hypothermia claimed them. Jake fashioned a makeshift sling from his rope and blanket, creating a pocket on either side of the saddle where the foals could rest. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't hold for a long journey, but it might get them the 3 miles back to the barn. Getting the foals into position was harder than he expected. They were frightened, weak, and confused, fighting even their own survival with the blind panic of creatures who knew only fear. Jake spoke to them constantly as he worked, his voice steady and calm even as his own hands began to lose feeling in the cold. Ghost stood like a statue, only his ears moving to track the sounds around them. The stallion seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, the importance of stillness and patience. Finally, both foals were secured, their small, dark heads poking out from the fabric cocoons Jake had created. They looked absurd, like some kind of bizarre cargo, but they were out of the snow and pressed against Ghost's warm sides. The stallion turned his head to look at them, and Jake could have sworn he saw understanding in those intelligent eyes. "Take care of them, boy," Jake said, putting his hand on Ghost's neck. "Get them home safe." Then he took the reins and began to walk, leading Ghost through the storm toward home. The wind had picked up even more, and the snow was falling so thick that Jake could barely see Ghost's white form beside him. The journey back to the ranch became a test of endurance that pushed Jake closer to his limits than he had been in years. Each step through the deepening snow required conscious effort, and the wind seemed determined to knock him off his feet. The lantern he carried swung wildly, its light barely penetrating the curtain of white that surrounded them. Jake kept one hand on Ghost's reins and the other holding the lantern, his fingers growing numb inside his gloves despite the fleece lining. The cold was the kind that made bones ache, that turned breath to ice crystals in beards and mustaches, that could kill a man before he even realized he was in trouble. Ghost pressed close to Jake's side, offering what shelter he could from his larger body. The stallion's instincts were remarkable. Whenever Jake stumbled or slowed, Ghost would pause and wait, sometimes even pressing against him as if to help keep him upright. The foals had gone quiet in their makeshift slings, which worried Jake more than their earlier cries. He could only hope they were conserving energy, rather than slipping away into the final sleep that cold brings to the dying time lost all meaning in the white void of the storm. Jake tried to keep track of landmarks, the old lightning-struck pine that marked the northern boundary, the rocky outcrop that looked like a sleeping bear, the frozen creek bed that wound its way down from the mountains. But everything looked different under its blanket of snow, and more than once Jake found himself second-guessing his direction. Only Ghost's steady confidence kept him moving forward. The stallion seemed to have an internal compass that never wavered, and Jake had learned long ago to trust the horse's sense of direction over his own. His legs felt like lead weights, each step requiring more effort than the last. The snow was past his knees now in places, and breaking trail was exhausting work. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps that burned his lungs with each inhalation of frigid air. He wanted to stop, to rest, to just sit down for a moment and catch his breath, but he knew that stopping in weather like this could be fatal. Men had been found frozen just yards from safety because they had stopped to rest and never started moving again. He thought about the foals, about their desperate cries for their mother, about the way they had pressed together trying to stay warm. He thought about Ghost, trusting him to get them all home safely. These thoughts kept his legs moving when everything in his body screamed to stop. The landmarks became more familiar as they descended from the higher elevations. There was the old line shack barely visible through the snow, its roof sagging under the weight of accumulated drifts. Another half-mile past, there was the south pasture fence, and beyond that, the ranch buildings. Jake felt a surge of hope that gave him renewed energy. They were going to make it, all of them, if luck held. Then Ghost stopped abruptly, his ears pinned back, his body tense. Jake knew that stance, had seen it before when the stallion sensed danger. He raised the lantern, trying to see what had alarmed the horse. At first he saw nothing but snow and darkness. Then movement caught his eye, low to the ground, and moving with predatory purpose wolves. At least 3 of them, possibly more, drawn by the scent of the foals and emboldened by the storm that had driven most prey into hiding. Jake's hand went automatically to the rifle in his saddle scabbard, but reaching it meant disturbing the foals, and he was reluctant to do that when they had finally settled. Instead, he drew his pistol from its holster, the metal so cold it burned his skin even through his glove. The wolves circled, staying just at the edge of the lantern's light, their eyes reflecting green in the darkness. They were desperate, Jake realized. The storm had made hunting nearly impossible, and they were taking a chance on attacking a full-grown horse and armed man because hunger had made them reckless. Ghost stood his ground, his body positioned protectively between the wolves and the foals. The stallion pawed the ground and let out a challenging snort, steam jetting from his nostrils like a dragon's breath. Jake had seen Ghost fight before, had watched him defend himself against a mountain lion with hooves and teeth, but he had never seen the stallion with something to protect beyond himself. There was something different in Ghost's stance now, something almost parental in the way he positioned himself as a barrier between the predators and the helpless foals. The alpha wolf made the first move, lunging forward with teeth bared. Jake fired, the shot echoing across the frozen landscape and sending the wolf tumbling backward into the snow. The rest of the pack scattered momentarily, but Jake knew they would be back. Wolves were persistent hunters, and the scent of the foals was too tempting. He fired again, not aiming to kill, but to drive them back, to make them understand that this prey was too dangerous to be worth the effort. The shots rang out like thunder in the muffled silence of the storm, and Jake counted each bullet carefully. He had 6 shots total, and he had just used 2. The wolves retreated further, but did not leave entirely. Jake could see them circling in the darkness beyond his lantern's reach, shadows moving through shadows. Ghost pawed the ground again and made a sound Jake had never heard from him before, a deep rumbling challenge that seemed to vibrate through the frozen air. The stallion was magnificent in that moment, white as the snow around him, but fierce as any guardian, protecting the weak with the same determination that had made him legendary among the ranch hands. Jake made a decision that went against every survival instinct he possessed. He fired another shot into the air, then another, using his precious ammunition not to kill but to create enough noise to either drive the wolves away permanently or attract attention from the ranch. Someone might hear the shots even through the storm, might come looking, might provide the backup that could make the difference between reaching safety and becoming another cautionary tale about the dangers of Montana winters. The wolves held their ground for a long moment, their predatory calculations weighing hunger against danger. Then, as if by some unspoken agreement, they melted back into the storm, becoming shadows, and then nothing at all. Jake waited, his gun still raised, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Ghost remained tense beside him, ready to fight if needed, but gradually the stallion's posture relaxed. The threat had passed, at least for now. Jake holstered his pistol with shaking hands and checked the foals. They were still breathing, still alive, though one of them had begun to shiver violently, despite being pressed against Ghost's warm side. That was actually a good sign. Jake knew shivering meant the body was still fighting hypothermia, still generating heat. It was when the shivering stopped that you had to worry. He adjusted the blankets around both foals, making sure they were as protected as possible, then took Ghost's reins again and continued forward. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else, distant and unresponsive. Each step was a negotiation between mind and body, willpower overriding the screaming exhaustion of muscles pushed far beyond their normal limits. Jake had always prided himself on his physical conditioning, the kind of strength that came from years of ranch work. But this was different. This was survival, pure and simple, and it was testing him in ways he had not been tested in years. The ranch buildings appeared suddenly through the curtain of snow, their dark shapes emerging like a mirage that Jake almost didn't trust. The main barn stood solid and square, its red paint barely visible under the coating of white, smoke rising from the small chimney that vented the wood stove they kept burning in winter. Light glowed from the windows of the bunkhouse, warm and welcoming, and Jake felt something break inside his chest at the sight. They had made it against all odds. Through the storm and the wolves and his own failing strength, they had made it home. Jake led Ghost directly to the barn, bypassing the bunkhouse where the ranch hands would be full of questions he did not have the energy to answer. The barn was warm compared to outside, heated by the presence of a dozen horses and the insulation of hay stored in the loft. The familiar smells of hay and horse and leather wrapped around Jake like a blanket, and he had to pause for a moment to steady himself, his vision swimming with exhaustion and relief. Ghost walked into his stall, as if he carried precious cargo every day, his movements careful and measured. Jake worked quickly, despite his frozen fingers, to release the makeshift slings and lift the foals down. They were both shivering now, which he took as an encouraging sign, but they were also clearly in bad shape. Their coats were still wet with melted snow, their eyes dull with exhaustion and cold, their small bodies alarmingly thin. Newborn foals should be nursing within hours of birth, getting the vital colostrum that would give them antibodies and energy. These two had been without food for at least a day, maybe longer, and that alone could kill them. Jake grabbed armfuls of clean straw and created a thick bed in the corner of Ghost's stall, the warmest spot in the barn. He placed both foals in the straw and covered them with every blanket he could find, wool and fleece and even an old buffalo hide that had been hanging on the wall. The foals huddled together instinctively, their small bodies seeking warmth from each other. Ghost stood over them, his head lowered, watching them with what Jake could only describe as concern. The door to the barn crashed open, and 3 ranch hands burst in, led by Tom Morrison, the foreman. They were bundled against the cold, their faces showing a mixture of relief and anger. "Mercer, we heard shots." "What the hell were you doing out in that storm?" Tom demanded, his voice rough with worry. Then he saw the foals and stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging open. "What in God's name?" "Found them about 3 miles northwest," Jake said, his voice hoarse from the cold and exertion. Twin foals, mother dead wolves, were circling. He did not mention how close it had been, How near he had come to failing, how his legs were still shaking with exhaustion. There was no point, the foals were here, alive, and that was what mattered. The other hands gathered around, their rough faces showing the kind of soft wonder that even hardened cowboys could not hide when confronted with something young and helpless. Billy Chin, the youngest of the crew, knelt beside the foals and reached out a tentative hand. "They're so small," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are they going to make it?" "That depends on the next few hours," Jake replied, already moving toward the supply room where they kept veterinary equipment. "They need warmth, food, and care. Tom, I need you to get Doc Hastings out here if the roads are passable. Billy, get the wood stove in here fired up hot, and someone find me some goat's milk or mare's milk replacement. These babies haven't nursed since birth." The men scattered to follow his orders, the emergency giving them purpose and direction. Jake allowed himself to lean against the wall for just a moment, his eyes closing, his body trembling with delayed reaction to everything they had been through. When he opened his eyes again, Ghost was looking at him, and Jake could have sworn the stallion nodded, as if to say they had done well, they had saved them. Doc Hastings arrived within the hour, his truck chains clanking through the snow that showed no signs of letting up. The veterinarian was a man in his 60s with hands that had delivered countless foals and saved even more horses from various ailments. He took one look at the twin colts huddled in their nest of blankets and shook his head slowly, though not with hopelessness, but with the measured assessment of someone who had seen every variation of difficult circumstances that ranch life could produce. "Hypothermia, dehydration, and starvation," he said, kneeling beside the foals with his medical bag. "The trifecta of problems for abandoned newborns. But their eyes are still bright, and they're fighting. That counts for something." He looked up at Jake, who stood nearby with his arms crossed, watching every movement the vet made. "You did good getting them here alive, Mercer. Most men would have left them to nature." Jake did not respond to the compliment, never comfortable with praise. Instead, he asked, "What are their chances?" Doc Hastings pulled out his stethoscope and listened to each foal's heart and lungs in turn. The first one, the slightly larger of the two, seemed stronger, more responsive to touch. The second was listless, its breathing shallow, its body temperature dangerously low despite the blankets and the warmth of the barn. 50-50 for the stronger one, maybe 60-40, the vet said honestly. The smaller one, I'd say 30-70 against. They need constant warming, feeding every 2 hours, and monitoring throughout the night. Even then, we could lose one or both before morning. Newborn foals are fragile in the best circumstances, and these two have been through hell. "I'll do it," Jake said immediately. "Whatever they need, I'll do it." The vet looked at him with raised eyebrows. "That means no sleep tonight. Probably not tomorrow night either. You'll need to tube feed them until they're strong enough to nurse from a bottle, keep them warm, watch for any signs of distress." "It's round-the-clock work, Jake." "I said I'll do it," Jake repeated, his voice firm. He had not risked his life and Ghosts to bring these foals home just to lose them now to neglect or insufficient care. The vet nodded and began showing Jake how to prepare the mare's milk replacement, how to insert the feeding tube gently down the foal's throat, how to recognize the signs of improvement or decline. The process was delicate and required patience that Jake possessed in abundance when it came to animals, if not always with people. The ranch hands took turns helping throughout that first night, but it was Jake who remained constant, who refused to leave the barn even when Tom Morrison tried to relieve him. Ghost stayed too, standing guard over the foals with a dedication that amazed everyone who witnessed it. The stallion would lower his head to sniff the babies periodically, making soft rumbling sounds that seemed to comfort them. At one point, when the smaller foal began to fade, its breathing becoming increasingly labored, Ghost actually lay down in the straw beside it, something the stallion almost never did, and pressed his warm body against the tiny creature. Jake watched this interaction with wonder. He had known Ghost was special from the day he won him, but this protective behavior toward foals that were not his own offspring spoke to something deeper in the horse's character. Ghost seemed to understand that these babies needed him, and the stallion was responding with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with his usual proud, somewhat aloof demeanor. The smaller foal rallied around midnight, its breathing becoming stronger, its body temperature slowly climbing. Jake felt a surge of hope that was almost painful in its intensity. He had learned long ago not to get attached too quickly to animals whose survival was uncertain, but these foals had already claimed a piece of his heart during that desperate journey through the blizzard. He found himself whispering to them as he worked, telling them about the ranch, about Ghost, about the life they could have if they just kept fighting. By dawn, both foals were noticeably stronger. The larger one, which Jake had started calling Scout in his mind because of its more adventurous attempts to stand, was actually able to hold its head up steadily. The smaller one, Shadow, named for its dark coat and its tendency to press close to Scout's side, was still weak but showing definite signs of improvement. Doc Hastings returned at first light and examined both foals with evident satisfaction. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "They made it through the night. That's the biggest hurdle. If they keep improving at this rate, I'd say their chances just jumped to 70-30 in favor." He looked at Jake, who looked like he had been through his own battle, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion, his clothes rumpled from sleeping in the straw when he slept at all. "You look like hell, Mercer, but you did good work here." The word spread through the ranch community faster than the storm had blown through. By noon, despite the continuing snowfall, people began showing up to see the miracle foals. Rachel Chen, Billy's mother and the ranch cook, brought fresh bread and hot soup, declaring that Jake needed sustenance if he was going to keep up this pace. She was a practical woman who had raised 5 children on the frontier and understood the demands of caring for helpless creatures. "You cannot save them if you collapse from exhaustion," she told Jake firmly, pressing a bowl of soup into his hands. "Eat. Sleep for a few hours. Billy and I will watch the foals." Jake wanted to refuse, but his body was betraying him. Swaying with fatigue, even as he stood, Ghost seemed to sense his master's condition and moved close, pressing his shoulder against Jake's side to steady him. The stallion's eyes were alert and focused on the foals, as if making a promise to keep watch. Reluctantly, Jake agreed to rest for 3 hours, no more. He found a pile of hay in the corner of the barn and collapsed into it fully clothed, asleep almost before his head settled. His dreams were filled with images of the blizzard, the wolves, the desperate cries of the foals, and through it all, Ghost's steady white presence, a beacon of reliability in the chaos. When Jake woke, the barn was full of afternoon light filtering through the windows, and he could hear soft voices near the foal's stall. He sat up quickly, his heart racing with momentary panic, but the voices were calm, even cheerful. He stood and walked to the stall to find both foals standing, albeit shakily, while Billy Chen and his mother watched with delight. Scout took a wobbly step forward, legs splaying like a newborn deer, while Shadow remained close to Ghost's legs. Drawing courage from the stallion's solid presence, Jake felt something catch in his throat at the sight. Just 12 hours ago, he had been certain these babies would not survive the night, and now they were standing, fighting, living. Rachel Chen looked up and saw Jake watching from the doorway, her round face breaking into a warm smile. "They have been up for 20 minutes, she said, her accent still carrying traces of her Cantonese heritage despite 40 years in Montana. The little one, Shadow, he stood first. Ghost helped him, nudging him until he found his feet. Jake moved into the stall, and both foals turned their heads toward him, their large dark eyes regarding him with what he chose to interpret as recognition. Scout took another unsteady step in his direction, and Jake knelt down to meet the foal at eye level, The baby sniffed his outstretched hand, its whiskers tickling his palm, and Jake felt a connection form that went beyond simple caretaker and animal. These foals had become his responsibility in a way that transcended normal ranch duties. Over the next 3 days, as the blizzard finally blew itself out and the Montana sky cleared to a brilliant crystalline blue, the foals gained strength with remarkable speed. Their appetite improved dramatically, and they began taking milk from bottles rather than needing tube feeding. A development that Doc Hastings declared excellent progress. Scout was bold and curious, investigating every corner of the stall and attempting to taste everything within reach, from hay to leather to Jake's coat buttons. Shadow was more reserved, staying close to Ghost and watching the world with wary intelligence, but showing flashes of playfulness that suggested a resilient spirit beneath the caution. Ghost's attachment to the foals deepened with each passing day. The Stallion had essentially adopted them, standing guard while they slept, nickering softly to encourage them when they attempted new skills, even allowing them to nurse against his side in a mockery of nursing behavior that clearly gave them comfort. Even though no milk came, Jake had never seen anything quite like it in all his years working with horses. Stallions were typically aggressive toward foals that were not their own, seeing them as potential competition or simply not caring about their existence, but Ghost treated Scout and Shadow with the tender protectiveness of a mother mare. The ranch hands began calling them Ghost's babies, and the name stuck. Visitors came from neighboring ranches to see the unusual family, the magnificent white Arabian stallion and his 2 dark foundlings. Stories spread through the county about Jake's rescue mission in the blizzard, growing more dramatic with each retelling, until some versions had him fighting off entire wolf packs single-handedly. Jake endured the attention with his usual stoic silence, deflecting praise and keeping conversation focused on the foals rather than his own actions. What he did not expect was the arrival, 1 week after the rescue, of Sarah Holbrook. She drove up to the ranch in a newish truck, a woman in her mid-30s with determined eyes and the practical clothing of someone who worked outdoors for a living. She introduced herself as a representative from the Wild Horse and Burro Protection Association, and Jake felt his guard go up immediately. He had encountered these advocacy groups before, well-meaning people who sometimes prioritized ideology over practical reality. "Mr. Mercer, I heard about your rescue of the twin foals," Sarah said, her handshake firm and direct. "I wanted to see them for myself and discuss their future." Jake's jaw tightened. Their future is here, on this ranch, where they are being cared for. Sarah held up her hands in a peacekeeping gesture. "I am not here to take them away. Actually, I wanted to thank you. Based on your description of where you found them, and the mare's coloring and markings, I believe these foals come from the Crystal Creek herd, a band of wild mustangs that has been struggling this winter. The mare you found was probably driven from the herd when she went into labor, which sometimes happens with difficult births." Jake processed this information, his mind putting together pieces. "So they are wild-born?" "Completely wild," Sarah confirmed. "Which makes what Ghost has done even more remarkable. Wild foals typically do not accept domestication this easily, especially not bonding with a domestic stallion." She paused, watching Scout and Shadow play in the paddock where Jake had moved them now that the weather had cleared. "Mr. Mercer, I would like to document this for our records." The bond between Ghost and these foals could provide valuable insights into equine behavior and socialization. "Would you be willing to let me visit periodically to observe and photograph them?" Jake considered the request carefully. He was a private man who did not like outsiders interfering in ranch business, but he also recognized that Sarah seemed genuinely interested in the horse's welfare rather than pushing an agenda. "What would this documentation entail?" he asked. "Monthly visits, photographs, and notes on their development and interaction with Ghost," Sarah replied. "No interference with your training methods or decisions about their care. You would retain full ownership and control." I am simply asking permission to observe and record." After a long pause, Jake nodded. "All right. But if your visits disturb the horses or disrupt ranch operations, the agreement ends." "Fair enough," Sarah said, extending her hand again. They shook on it, and Sarah spent the next hour in the paddock, photographing Scout and Shadow as they explored their new outdoor space with Ghost hovering nearby. She showed particular interest in the way Ghost positioned himself between the foals and anything he perceived as potentially threatening, even something as harmless as a chicken that wandered too close. That evening, after Sarah had left, Jake sat on the fence watching Ghost graze while the foals nursed their bottles held steady by Billy Chen. The young ranch hand had become almost as attached to the babies as Jake was, spending his free time in the barn, teaching them to accept halters and lead ropes. Tom Morrison joined Jake at the fence, 2 mugs of coffee in his hands. He passed one to Jake, and they drank in comfortable silence for a while, watching the peaceful scene. "You know those foals have changed things around here," Tom said finally. "The men are different. Softer somehow, but not in a bad way. They care about something besides work and paychecks." Jake nodded, understanding exactly what the foreman meant. The transformation in Jake himself was perhaps the most remarkable change, though he would never have acknowledged it. The solitary cowboy who had always kept people at arm's length found himself talking more, sharing stories about Ghost and the foals with visitors who came to see them. He discovered a patience he had not known he possessed, spending hours teaching Scout and Shadow basic skills, rewarding their smallest accomplishments with quiet praise and gentle touches. The wall he had built around himself after years of disappointments and losses began to crack, letting in light he had forgotten existed. Spring arrived gradually, the snow melting to reveal brown grass that would soon turn green with new growth. Scout and Shadow, now 3 months old, had grown into leggy, energetic youngsters who spent their days racing around the paddock in explosive bursts of speed that left the ranch hands laughing at their antics. They had developed distinct personalities that became more pronounced as they matured. Scout was fearless and outgoing, the first to investigate anything new, always pushing boundaries and testing limits. Shadow was thoughtful and observant, hanging back to assess situations before committing, but showing surprising cleverness in solving problems. Ghost remained their constant guardian and teacher. The Stallion taught them things that Jake could not, lessons in being a horse that only another horse could impart. He showed them how to use their hooves to paw through snow to reach grass beneath, how to establish dominance in the herd hierarchy without unnecessary aggression, how to read the subtle body language that horses use to communicate. When Scout got too rough in play, Ghost would pin his ears and drive the colt away briefly, a correction that Scout accepted and learned from. When Shadow showed fear of the farrier during their first hoof trimming, Ghost stood beside the young colt, calm and reassuring, until Shadow relaxed enough to allow the work. Jake documented all of this in a journal he had started at Sarah Holbrook's suggestion, though he kept many of his observations private, too personal to share even with someone as respectful as Sarah. He wrote about the morning he found all 3 horses sleeping together in the sun, Ghost lying down with both foals curled against his belly like overgrown puppies. He recorded the day Scout successfully jumped the small creek that ran through the pasture, then immediately ran back to show Shadow how to do it. He noted the way Ghost would sometimes stand at the fence looking toward the northwest, toward the mountains where the wild herds roamed, and the way the foals would stand beside him, looking in the same direction as if they could sense something calling to them from that distant wilderness. The incident that would test everything came on a warm April morning when the ranch was preparing for spring roundup. Jake had taken Ghost and the colts to the far pasture, planning to work on more advanced leading exercises. The foals were old enough now to be separated from Ghost for short periods, though neither they nor the Stallion enjoyed the separation. Jake had Scout on a lead rope and was teaching the colt to walk beside him at various paces, when he heard Ghost's alarm call, a sound he had only heard a handful of times in all their years together. Jake turned to see a mountain lion crouched on a rocky outcrop above the pasture, its amber eyes fixed on Shadow, who stood alone near a cluster of boulders. The big cat was magnificent and terrifying, easily 200 pounds of pure predator, muscles bunched and ready to spring. Time seemed to slow as Jake's mind raced through options. He was too far away to reach Shadow before the lion struck. His rifle was back with Ghost's saddle. All he had was a lead rope and a 3-month-old colt who would be defenseless if the lion chose to attack. But Ghost was already moving. The stallion charged across the pasture with speed that seemed impossible for a horse his age, his hooves thundering against the earth, his ears pinned flat against his skull. He placed himself between Shadow and the mountain lion, rearing up to his full height and screaming a challenge that echoed off the surrounding hills. The lion hesitated, reassessing this unexpected opposition. Most prey animals ran from predators, but this white stallion was attacking, and the sheer audacity of it gave the cat pause. Jake ran toward them, shouting and waving his arms, trying to make himself seem larger and more threatening than he was. Scout, responding to the tension and fear in the air, stuck close to Jake's side, his small body trembling, but his feet still moving forward. Shadow had frozen in place, caught between the instinct to run and the paralysis of terror. Ghost remained between the foal and the lion, stamping and snorting, every line of his body radiating aggression and protective fury. The standoff lasted perhaps 30 seconds but felt like an eternity. Then the mountain lion, faced with multiple targets who refused to behave like proper prey, decided the hunt was not worth the risk. It backed away slowly, never taking its eyes off Ghost, then turned and bounded up the rocks with fluid grace, disappearing into the tree line above. Jake reached Shadow and Ghost, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. He ran his hands over Shadow, checking for injuries, finding none. The colt was shaking but unharmed, pressing against Ghost's side with desperate relief. Ghost was breathing hard, his white coat dark with sweat, but his eyes were bright and alert, scanning the rocks for any sign the lion might return. Jake put his hand on the stallion's neck, feeling the powerful muscles still tense and ready. "Good boy," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Good boy, Ghost. You saved him." The stallion turned his head to look at Jake, and in that moment, man and horse shared an understanding that went beyond words. They were a family now, the four of them, bound together by shared danger and mutual protection, by love that had grown from unlikely circumstances into something unbreakable. Jake led them all back to the barn, keeping Scout and Shadow close, Ghost walking beside them with watchful vigilance. The near tragedy had shaken Jake more than he wanted to admit. He had already lost too much in his life, too many people and animals and opportunities that had slipped through his fingers. The thought of losing Shadow to a predator's attack, of failing to protect one of these foals he had risked everything to save, was almost unbearable. That night, Jake moved a cot into the barn and slept beside the stall where Ghost and the foals rested. He told himself it was practical, that he needed to monitor them after the stress of the mountain lion encounter, but the truth was simpler and more vulnerable than that. He needed to be close to them, needed the reassurance of their breathing and their warmth, needed to know they were safe. Tom Morrison found him there at dawn, sitting on the cot with a cup of cold coffee in his hands, watching the 3 horses sleep in a pile of hay in contentment. "You are getting too attached," Tom said quietly, settling onto an overturned bucket nearby. It was not a criticism, just an observation from a man who had known Jake for 15 years and understood the walls he had built around his heart. "I know," Jake replied, surprising himself with the admission. "But I cannot seem to help it. These foals, Ghost, they have become something I did not know I needed." Tom was silent for a moment, considering his words carefully. What happens when they grow up? When Scout and Shadow are ready to be sold or trained for work? Can you let them go? The question hit Jake like a physical blow because he had been avoiding thinking about it for weeks. Foals grew up. That was the nature of things. They became yearlings, then 2-year-olds ready for training, then horses with jobs and purposes. On a working ranch, animals were assets, not pets, and sentimental attachment was a luxury that could lead to poor business decisions. But the thought of selling Scout or Shadow, of separating them from Ghost and from him, felt wrong in a way that defied rational explanation. "I do not know," Jake said honestly. "I have not figured that part out yet." Tom nodded, understanding the complexity of what Jake was feeling. "Well, you have time. They are still babies. But you should think about it, Jake, about what you want their future to be and yours." The foreman stood and stretched, his joints popping. "By the way, Sarah Holbrook called yesterday. She wants to bring some people from the university to observe Ghost in the foals. Something about studying their social bonds for research. You interested?" Jake considered the request. Part of him wanted to say no, to keep his unusual family private and protected from outside scrutiny. But another part of him, the part that was slowly opening to the world again, recognized that what Ghost had done was remarkable enough to deserve documentation. "Maybe," he said. "Let me think about it." Tom left, and Jake remained sitting on the cot, watching as Shadow woke and stood, stretching like a cat before moving to nuzzle Ghost's neck. The stallion rumbled softly in response, a sound of contentment and affection that Jake felt in his own chest. The university researchers came 2 weeks later, a team of 3 led by Professor Elena Martinez, an equine behavior specialist who had studied wild horse herds for 20 years. She was a small woman with intense dark eyes and an obvious passion for her subject that reminded Jake of Sarah Holbrook. She spent an entire day observing Ghost in the foals, taking notes and photographs, asking Jake questions about their routines and behaviors. What struck her most, she explained, was the sophistication of Ghost's parenting behavior. Stallions in wild herds typically have nothing to do with raising foals, she said, watching Ghost guide Scout away from a potentially dangerous fence post. That is the mare's job. But Ghost is displaying behaviors I have only seen in led mares. Teaching behaviors, protective instincts, even what appears to be disciplinary correction. It is extraordinary. She turned to Jake with curiosity bright in her eyes. "Has Ghost ever sired foals of his own?" "No," Jake replied. "He came to me uncut, but I never bred him. Seemed wrong somehow to reduce him to stud work when he had so much more to offer." Professor Martinez nodded slowly, her mind clearly working through implications. "I wonder if that is part of what we are seeing here. Ghost has all these instincts to nurture and protect, instincts that would normally be directed toward his own offspring, and he has channeled them toward Scout and Shadow. It is a fascinating example of behavioral plasticity in horses. Over the next several weeks, the ranch became something of a destination for people interested in animal behavior. Other researchers came, then journalists, then filmmakers who wanted to document Ghost's story for a nature program. Jake allowed it all with reluctant grace, understanding that the attention served a purpose beyond satisfying curiosity. If Ghost's relationship with the foals could teach people something valuable about horse cognition and emotion, then the invasion of privacy was worth it. But the attention also brought unwanted complications. A representative from a wealthy Arabian horse breeding program contacted Jake with an offer to purchase Ghost for an astronomical sum, citing the stallion's obvious intelligence and gentle temperament as desirable traits for their breeding line. Jake refused without even considering it. Then came an offer for the foals themselves from a wild horse sanctuary that wanted to study their transition from rescue to domestication. Again, Jake refused. Finally came the offer that truly tested him. A therapeutic riding program in Oregon, one that worked with disabled children, had heard about Ghost's gentle nature and protective instincts. They offered Jake a position as head trainer, a significant salary increase, and the promise that Ghost and the foals could come with him and would be used in their program. It was an opportunity to do meaningful work, to use his skills in a way that helped people rather than just managing livestock. It was also a chance to start over somewhere new, to leave behind the loneliness and isolation that had defined his life for so long. Jake took the offer letter to Tom Morrison, seeking advice from the one person whose judgment he trusted completely. The foreman read it carefully, then handed it back with a thoughtful expression. "This is a good opportunity, Jake. Maybe the kind of change you need." But Jake heard the unspoken question beneath the words. "Is it what you want?" That night, Jake sat in the barn with Ghost and the foals, the offer letter in his hands, watching moonlight stream through the windows and paint everything silver and shadow. Scout was sleeping with his head on Ghost's back while Shadow dozed nearby, one ear flicking occasionally to track sounds only horses could hear. Jake realized with sudden clarity that this was not about the job offer at all. It was about fear. Fear of losing what he had built here. Fear of caring too much. Fear of opening his heart only to have it broken again by circumstances beyond his control. He had spent years protecting himself from that kind of pain, by keeping everyone and everything at a distance. But Ghost and the foals had slipped past his defenses without him even realizing it was happening. And now the thought of disrupting their lives, of taking them away from the only home Scout and Shadow had ever known, felt like a betrayal. The next morning, Jake called the therapeutic riding program and declined their offer. The director was disappointed, but understanding, and she suggested he keep her number in case he ever changed his mind. After hanging up, Jake felt a weight lift from his chest that he had not even known was there. He walked out to the pasture where Ghost was teaching Scout and Shadow how to move cattle, the Stallion demonstrating patience and precision while the young Colts bumbled around trying to imitate him. The sight made Jake smile, something he found himself doing more often these days. Sarah Holbrook arrived for her monthly visit that afternoon, and Jake told her about his decision to stay. She was not surprised. "This is where you belong," she said simply, watching Shadow successfully cut a young heifer from the small herd they kept for training purposes. "These foals need you, and I think maybe you need them too." She paused, then added, "I have been documenting their progress for 7 months now, and I have never seen anything quite like what Ghost has accomplished with them. He has taken 2 wild-born foals who should have died and turned them into confident, well-adjusted horses who trust humans and understand their place in a domestic herd. That is remarkable." Jake nodded, accepting the praise on Ghost's behalf, since the Stallion could not speak for himself. "They are good colts," he said, which was high praise coming from him. "They have heart, both of them. Scout will make someone an excellent cow horse someday. Shadow has the intelligence for more complex work, maybe search and rescue or trail riding in difficult terrain." The words were out before Jake realized he had said them, and the implication hit him hard. He was talking about their futures as if they would be leaving, as if he would be selling them when they reached training age. Sarah caught the tension in his expression and asked gently, "Are you planning to sell them?" Jake did not answer immediately. He watched Scout charge at a confused heifer with more enthusiasm than skill, scattering the small herd in multiple directions while Ghost moved smoothly to restore order. "I do not know," Jake admitted finally. "The practical part of me says I should. They will be valuable horses when they are trained, and the ranch could use the income. But the thought of it makes me feel sick." "Then do not sell them," Sarah said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "Keep them. Train them yourself. Use them here on the ranch." Jake shook his head. "That is not how ranching works. You cannot keep every animal you become attached to. It is not practical or sustainable." Sarah smiled. "Jake, you rode into a blizzard that killed 3 people in this county alone to rescue foals you did not even know existed. You spent weeks nursing them back to health, sleeping in the barn, putting their needs before your own. Practical went out the window the moment you made that decision." What you did was driven by something deeper than practicality, and I think you know that. Her words stayed with Jake long after she left. That night, he did something he had not done in years. He called his sister in Colorado, a woman he had not spoken to in over 18 months due to the usual family complications and unresolved tensions. Margaret was surprised to hear from him, but pleased, and they talked for over an hour. Jake told her about Ghost in the Foals, about the rescue and the months of care, about the way his life had changed in ways he was still trying to understand. "You sound different," Margaret said near the end of the conversation. "Happier, more engaged with life." Jake considered this observation. "Maybe I am," he said. "These horses have taught me something about letting people in, about caring, even when it is risky." Margaret was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "I am glad, Jake. After everything you went through with Dad's death and the divorce, I worried you had shut yourself off completely. It is good to know something has brought you back." After they hung up, Jake sat on his porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Ghost and the foals visible in the pasture below. The foals were 6 months old now, growing rapidly, their legs seeming too long for their bodies in that awkward adolescent way. Soon they would be yearlings, then 2-year-olds ready for serious training. Time was moving forward whether Jake was ready or not, carrying them all toward futures that were still uncertain, but somehow felt less frightening than they had before Tom Morrison joined him on the porch with 2 beers, passing one to Jake without comment. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, then Tom said, "I have been thinking about those foals, about what to do with them when they are grown." Jake waited, knowing Tom had something specific in mind. "What if we kept them here, trained them ourselves, and used them in the operation? We could use a couple more good horses, especially ones with Scout's speed and Shadow's intelligence. It would mean less income than selling them, but it would also mean keeping the family together." Family. The word resonated with Jake in ways he had not expected. That is what they had become, this unlikely group of Man and Stallion and 2 rescued Colts. A family bound together by circumstance and choice, by shared danger and mutual care, by love that had grown in the spaces between practicality and possibility. "I would like that," Jake said quietly. "I would like that very much." 2 years passed like water flowing downstream, inevitable and transforming everything in its path. Scout and Shadow grew into magnificent horses, their dark coats gleaming with health and vitality, their movements powerful and graceful. Scout developed into exactly what Jake had predicted, a fearless cow horse with speed and agility that made him invaluable during roundups. Shadow became something more unexpected, a horse with an almost supernatural ability to navigate difficult terrain and sense danger before it materialized, making him perfect for the mountain trails where the ranch ran its summer cattle operations. Ghost remained their constant companion and teacher, though the dynamic had shifted as the Colts matured into young stallions in their own right. The relationship was no longer that of parent and children, but something more complex and beautiful, a partnership of equals bound by shared history and mutual respect. Ghost was 13 when Jake had won him, and now at 17 the stallion showed his age in the silver that had spread through his mane and the deliberate way he moved on cold mornings. But his eyes remained bright and alert, his spirit undiminished by the passing years. Jake had changed too in ways that surprised everyone who knew him, including himself. The solitary cowboy who had once preferred silence and isolation now found himself at the center of a community that had grown around the story of Ghost in the Foals. The ranch had become a destination for people interested in horse rescue and rehabilitation, and Jake had reluctantly accepted a role as an informal mentor to others who wanted to learn his methods. He discovered he had a gift for teaching, a patience and clarity that helped others understand the subtle language of horses. Rachel Chen had retired from cooking for the ranch hands, but she still visited regularly to check on what she called her miracle horses. Billy Chen, her son, had become Jake's primary assistant, a skilled horseman in his own right, who had learned much of what he knew by watching Jake work with Scout and Shadow. The young man had even started his own small rescue operation, taking in abandoned or abused horses and rehabilitating them, using the gentle techniques Jake had demonstrated with the twin Colts. Sarah Holbrook's documentation of Ghost's story had been published in several academic journals, and a short documentary film about the rescue had won awards at wildlife film festivals. The attention had brought both welcome and unwelcome changes to the ranch, but Jake had learned to navigate the balance between sharing the story and protecting the privacy and well-being of his horses. Professor Martinez had returned several times to continue her research, and her findings about equine cognition and emotional capacity had influenced how horse training was taught at universities across the country. The winter that Scout and Shadow turned 2 years old brought another blizzard, not as severe as the one that had nearly claimed their lives, but significant enough to shut down the county for 3 days. Jake stood in the barn doorway, watching snow fall in thick curtains across the pasture, Ghost beside him as always, and he found his thoughts drifting back to that night when he had made the decision to ride out into the storm. He had not known what he was looking for then, had been driven by instinct and intuition rather than rational planning. But he had found more than just 2 dying foals in that blizzard. He had found purpose and connection, had rediscovered parts of himself he thought were lost forever. Scout and Shadow came trotting up through the snow, their dark forms striking against the white landscape, steam rising from their nostrils in the cold air. They were no longer the tiny, helpless creatures Jake had carried home wrapped in blankets. They were strong, confident horses who knew their worth and their place in the world, but they still sought out Ghost's presence, still positioned themselves close to the white stallion who had saved them and raised them, still looked to him for guidance and approval. Jake watched the 3 horses together and felt a profound sense of gratitude that caught him off guard with its intensity. This was what he had been missing all those years of self-imposed isolation. This sense of belonging to something larger than himself. This feeling of being needed and valued, not for what he could produce or accomplish, but simply for who he was. Ghost had taught him that. Not through words, but through the example of unconditional love and protection the stallion had shown to 2 foals who were not his own. That evening, Jake did something he had started doing regularly over the past 2 years. He called Margaret, his sister, and they talked about their lives, their memories, their hopes for the future. The conversations were still sometimes awkward, still touched by old wounds that had not fully healed, but they were trying, both of them, to rebuild the connection that family should provide. Margaret was planning to visit in the spring, her first trip to Montana in over a decade, and Jake found himself looking forward to it, wanting to show her Ghost and Scout and Shadow, wanting to share with her the life he had built from the ashes of his old loneliness. As he ended the call and walked back out to the barn for a final check on the horses before bed, Jake paused in the doorway and looked at the scene before him. Ghost stood in his stall with Scout on one side and Shadow on the other, the 3 of them drowsing in the warm glow of the barn lights, content and safe. The image reminded Jake of that first night when he had brought the dying foals home, when Ghost had first shown that remarkable protective instinct that would define their relationship. Jake pulled out his phone and took a photograph, wanting to capture this moment of peace and belonging. Then he walked to Ghost's stall and stood with the 3 horses, his hand on the white stallion's neck, feeling the warmth and solidity of the animal who had changed his life in ways he was still discovering. "Thank you," he said softly, though he was not entirely sure if he was speaking to Ghost, to the universe, or to whatever force had compelled him to ride out into that blizzard 2 years ago. Ghost turned his head and huffed softly against Jake's shoulder, a gesture of affection and acknowledgement. Scout and Shadow stirred but did not wake, trusting in the safety that Ghost and Jake provided. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the Montana landscape in pristine white, covering the world in possibility and promise. But inside the barn, there was only warmth and connection, only the quiet breathing of horses and man, only the simple, profound truth that love, in whatever form it takes, is always worth the risk of caring. Jake stood there for a long time, surrounded by his unlikely family, grateful beyond words for the moment of instinct that had sent him into the storm and for the courage to let these magnificent creatures into his guarded heart. The journey that had begun with desperate cries in a blizzard had led him here, to this moment of peace and belonging, to this understanding that sometimes the things we rescue end up rescuing us in return.